Good evening. Welcome to Sibley Hall. We're not at the journalism school, some of you probably realize, because we couldn't accommodate everybody there. My name is Michael Pollan. I'm the Knight Professor of Science and Environmental Journalism at the Journalism School. And this event is being sponsored by the Journalism School and the Knight program in particular. The Knight program in Science and Environmental Journalism does a lot of things, but one of the things they do is they do public events for the community and the campus on issues having to do with science, the environment, food issues. Many of our events have been about. I have a sign-up sheet if you'd like to be kept apprised. If you heard about this event not from our email list and you want to hear about future events, there'll be a clipboard passing around with a pen, and just put down your name and your email, and we'll make sure to let you know about future events. Can you pass this around?
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm actually, and frankly, delighted to be taking part in a conversation today that's not about food. It doesn't happen very often to me, though I suspect we may actually touch on it, since food is a big environmental issue and a big climate change issue. I first heard of Ted Nordhaus and Michael Shellenberger 3 years ago, shortly after they circulated a rather incendiary manifesto at a meeting of environmental grant makers. The Death of Environmentalism became one of the most notorious pieces of writing in that community, and did ignite, as the publicists say, ignite a firestorm. It came on the heels of the 2004 election, although actually I think it was written just before that, a time of great despondency in the environmental movement, both politically and psychologically. And there was suddenly lots of debate on the internet, especially about this, who were these guys? They became known as the bad boys of environmentalism. And I didn't know who they were, but I found their argument very challenging and provocative as someone who'd been writing about nature and the environment for many years and questioning some of the kind of deeper assumptions of the environmental movement in America. And I actually taught the essay in one of my classes and grew curious about it. The Death of Environmentalism challenged the leaders of that movement to re-examine some of their most cherished assumptions about our relationship to the natural world, about science, about the framing of environmentalism as a story about pollution, and the movement's hostility to things like progress, technology, markets, and its focus on limits. Specifically, they argued that the sort of politics that dealt with some success with things like the ozone hole and acid rain would not be able to deal with climate change. Having declared the death of environmentalism, they then set about attempting to offer a new politics of, well, I'm not sure exactly what they'd call it, and we'll ask them that, because I don't think they're comfortable with the term environmentalism at all. But a new politics to help us deal with climate change. This was when I met the bad boys, who actually called me out of the blue and invited me out to lunch, and they were on a quest to develop this new politics and new ideas, and they were interviewing a whole lot of people, and they took me out to a very nice lunch at Oliveto, and they were clearly looking for fresh ways of thinking, and I have a feeling I let them down, but they weren't deterred, and they kept going, and a couple years later produced this very, very interesting book, which we'll be talking about tonight. So I want to introduce Michael and Ted. Both of them have spent their entire careers. They have the same bio, which is I've never seen with two people. They spent their entire career working for environmental organizations. They're the managing directors of a survey research and political consulting firm called American Environics. They'll correct me if I've mispronounced it. And they're founders of the Breakthrough Institute. Most important for our purposes, and I think for their long-term impact on our society and the environmental movement. They're the authors of Breakthrough, From the Death of Environmentalism to the Politics of Possibility. Before I call them up, I want to tell you that, as you saw, there are copies available for signing, for purchase first and then signing afterward. And so they will be here if you want to stick around. And I will be here too. And I think they're copies of my book. And then books by an author I happen to know is in Manhattan right now, but her books are here as well. So please, Ted and Michael, if you'll join us. By the way, this is Michael and this is Ted.
We can't keep it straight all the time.
They share a biography, but they don't share other things like a body. Or wives. I've met both their wives. And the other thing I want to say is we're going to talk.
Don't be so sure about that.
This is Berkeley, after all.
We're going to talk for a half hour, 40 minutes, I guess, and then I'd really like to throw it open to you. I know that there are people in this room who know a lot more than I do about some of the issues in this book, and we'd very much like to hear questions from you as well. I guess I'd like to start by asking you, and I was curious about this, why you didn't call your book The Death of Environmentalism, because this had been your signature move, this manifesto. Was that no longer news 3 years later, or was perhaps environmentalism feeling a little too undead for such a declaration?
Go ahead.
Yeah. You guys can decide what questions.
Yeah,
questions for you.
I mean, I think what the working title for the book for a long time was The Death of Environmentalism, and we sort of broached the topic with our publisher at various times about whether maybe we shouldn't come up with a new title, but they were very, they had bought The Death of Environmentalism, and that was going to be the title of the book. And finally, late last year, they were like, well, okay, what would you like to title it? And I think we had really always been interested in sort of something that implied some movement from the death of environmentalism to what came next. And at various times, it was expressed in various expressions of the subtitle or whatever. But and so finally, and I think it really also came at a moment when we had taken a really deep dive into the energy science, which I think neither of us ever really kind of thought of ourselves as the kind of people who did that. We were sort of political guys, and we sort of dealt with policy, but really in a sort of larger sort of social, cultural, political context. But what became clear to us as we reviewed a lot of the energy literature was that the sort of conventional, we had come to the idea that the sort of conventional regulation-centered politics that the environmental movement has sort of long championed had a whole set of problems politically, and that's where we really sort of started this journey 3 or 4 years ago. But I think what we then increasingly became convinced of was that not only was it not good politics, but that it actually couldn't get us where we needed to go in terms of dealing with the climate crisis without pretty significant technical and technological breakthroughs in terms of alternative energy sources. We also had an institute called the Breakthrough Institute, so being clever fellows. The Breakthrough Institute we actually created back before we wrote the essay.
So you don't think environmentalism is any less dead than it was in 2004?
Well, we didn't actually. It has often been one of the things that folks. You said environmentalism is dead. We actually never said environmentalism is dead.
Why don't we go back and tell us a little bit about? Why don't you summarize that essay? Because a lot of people in this room probably haven't read it.
Well, we argued that. We didn't argue that environmentalism is dead. We argued that it needed to die.
I see.
And the reason for that, and it's quite central to the argument of the essay, is that we just became convinced that environmentalism institutionally and conceptually was just not capable of addressing what was the great ecological crisis of our time, global warming and climate change. And really that was sort of based on a particular focus on what we describe in the book as the politics of limits. The idea that this was fundamentally a pollution problem that would be solved the same way that we dealt with clean air and clean water and acid rain and CFCs and a whole set of past problems. And we wrote the essay in part because we'd become very frustrated as we tried to sort of pioneer this very different approach to dealing with that crisis, which involved really making big public investments to jumpstart that transition to a clean energy economy, focusing as much on building the clean energy economy as tearing down and regulating the dirty energy economy. And just the fact that the environmental movement sort of seemed unable to kind of grasped this opportunity to really sort of redefine the whole political landscape, not just around environmental issues, but otherwise in ways that would be very, very beneficial to advancing all the things that we needed to do to deal with climate change. And what resulted from that, we then went and did a whole series. We sort of kind of, well, why is this? And that's when we started deciding to write this essay. And we then went and interviewed a whole set of leading national environmental leaders, and out of that became really convinced that there was just a whole mental model for and kind of conceptual framework within environmentalism that was getting in the way of doing the work that we needed to do. So that's why we named the essay The Death of Environmentalism, and still to this day believe that, and I've obviously sort of expanded our reasons why in the book, that just literally this ethic that is primarily and has been primarily focused on limiting human intrusions upon nature is not terribly well suited to literally going to promoting and unleashing a whole set of new kinds of human activity, human creativity, ingenuity, innovation, and economic development. It's a creative enterprise, not a restrictive one. And we think that there are a whole set of things, which hopefully we can sort of talk a little bit more about tonight, that really get in the way of sort of environmentalism philosophically and politically being able to kind of to promote that kind of agenda.
Mm-hmm. Michael, talk a little bit about the fact, I gather what you're saying is that the traditional framework of environmentalism, which is based around a narrative about pollution, and protecting nature against what humans do to nature, it was effective accomplishing certain things, right?
Yeah, it was.
So what was different about those things than this thing?
Right. Well, so in the book we talk about, and I think it's important to also point out that this book is, it sort of is about global warming and about environmentalism, but it's also about a larger politics. And so the last half of the book is also about liberalism and about how society has changed since the 1960s and how our politics needs to change too. But the argument that we make about environmentalism is that environmentalism did a fairly good job dealing with problems like smog in Los Angeles, catalytic converters on tailpipes, getting lead out of gasoline, or in the case of acid rain, we put some scrubbers on smokestacks, and these were fairly inexpensive technical fixes that didn't require moving away from coal and oil. We could still burn coal and oil and deal with those earlier pollution problems. Similar thing with the Montreal Protocol, which was the protocol that banned ozone-depleting chemicals. Most people don't know it, but actually the chemicals to replace the ozone-depleting chemicals were actually, the alternative chemicals were already sort of in existence. And it really, that technological breakthrough actually propelled the political breakthrough, which is an important point on global warming. So we kind of point out, well, those were inexpensive, relatively easy fixes. But moving away from coal and oil, which are, the fossil fuels are like 80% of our energy sources, is a huge enterprise. It is such a central part of the economy. It's very expensive. You've got huge political interests on it. And so it requires not just a kind of different policy framework, which the environmental movement really hasn't kind of put forward. It requires even a whole new philosophical one as well.
Now let's wind the clock back to 2004, though. This was a very depressing moment for anyone who was concerned about climate change or any other environmental issue. Bush was reelected. He had done many things to gut regulations, environmental regulations. Lots of distortions of science were going on. There were questions being raised by the government and by scientists associated with the energy industry, climate change doubters. And so it was a moment at which environmentalism looked to be really nearly irrelevant. But then something happened, of course. Two things happened, I guess. There was Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth, and there was Hurricane Katrina. And I don't know what, I'm curious to know what you think of those two events, kind of put the issue back on the front burner, at least as a matter of media attention, but I think cultural attention. Children all over America saw this movie. It made lots of money, and it clearly made an impression on people. So suddenly, and that, I gather, was a pretty conventional pollution story, right? That was...
Absolutely, and if you watch An Inconvenient Truth, that's the way Gore describes it. The whole thing sort of opens with nature, him having this kind of harmonious experience of nature on his hometown, on his home farm. And the story is one of dealing with pollution. And I think the point that we make in the book, and most people don't know this, and even when we say it, people don't believe us. So I'll say it anyway, and you can go and do your own research. But incredibly, the movie, when it came out at the height of the publicity around Inconvenient Truth, Pew, which is one of the big environmental funders, did a poll, and they found that global warming still ranked, as it always has, as a fairly low-level concern, about 16th out of about 20 priorities tested. And then 7 months later,
how does that? Tell me how that question is phrased.
It's basically what is the most important issue facing the country?
So you're asking them for the most important issue, and what percentage tell you that?
Actually, you give people a list of issues, and you can say this is one of the most important or somewhat important.
I see. Okay.
So they're using the same scale to rate 16 or 20 or 25 issues.
So then they do the same question 7 months later in January of 2007, and the importance of that issue actually declined to somewhere around 20th. And our point is like, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you're a politician and you're going to take the right or wrong action on global warming, you're just not. If you do the right thing for your constituents on the top 3 priorities, you're not going to be punished for it come election time. If you vote the wrong way on something that's a low priority. The other thing we point out is, and folks here probably remember, November we had a ballot initiative that would have taxed oil production actually to fund clean energy, and voters rejected that initiative. So our point is that, and again, we wrote our essay before the November elections.
Sure.
We were making an argument in 2004. We were making an argument about what environmentalism needed to do in order to deal with global warming. We weren't sort of saying, well, environmentalists aren't popular enough. It was more like, this is all conceptually wrong. And the point that we make in the book is that the big point is that as long as environmental and ecological questions are counterposed by economic development or jobs, then it's going to lose.
You mean as long as it's assumed to be a trade-off?
Exactly.
And that you have to sacrifice economic growth or economic well-being.
Exactly.
So you're saying really nothing happened with Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth, aside from him getting an Academy Award?
Well, actually, something really important did happen. I think it's been widely misunderstood what the impact of Inconvenient Truth was. The impact of that movie and all of the sort of stuff that happened around it, it had a huge impact on opinion elites, on policymakers and media makers and newspaper editors and investment bankers and a whole set of people who have a whole lot of power to sort of affect, to set the agenda. And I think that's significant and should not be understated. What it didn't have a big impact on is public opinion, and there are, I think there are limits. There are limits to what elite opinion can do, and I think one of our concerns that we've sort of articulated both in the book and in sort of subsequent writing and research that we've done in our day jobs as sort of social values and opinion researchers is just that I think we're kind of coming to a place here not long from now, if the environmental movement is successful and if Democrats take over Congress, where those two things are potentially going to run smack into each other. And,
what do you mean?
Well, you're going to have a coal and oil industries who are going to spend a whole lot of money to get people very, very worried about what the impact of carbon cap and auctioning carbon credits, things like that are going to be on the economy, on people's electricity prices. And frankly, if you look at what some of the more ambitious pieces of legislation will do, even their proponents sort of will acknowledge that actually, particularly for folks in lower income brackets, it will have a huge impact. Energy costs increasing $750,000 a year for working class Americans.
$750 or $1,000.
So it's between somewhere in that range. Just I think even with the Lieberman bill, which seems to be the sort of vehicle, the primary vehicle folks are focused on right now. So not to get too much into the minutia, but if you can just go look at the survey data, or we just did focus groups in Tucson, Arizona, in one of the key congressional swing districts, and I'll tell you, energy prices and energy costs were much higher and more salient concern for those voters who, among other things, are going to determine who is going to be in control of the Congress over the next couple of election cycles.
So that suggests we're not going to hear a lot about climate change in the general election.
I don't think we are. I think that all of the Democratic candidates are going to be right on climate change. They're all going to endorse 80% by 2050, and they're not going to spend much time talking about it. And I wouldn't expect to see it be a particularly important or deciding issue.
Now, what about Hurricane Katrina? Did that change public opinion in any kind of meaningful way or not?
I think it had a greater impact on Bush, on public opinion about Bush and his performance as president than it did on attitudes towards global warming. I mean, the interesting thing, as Michael pointed out, is it goes well before 2006. I mean, public opinion on climate change has been relatively stable for the last 15, 20 years. So you go back, you can track Gallup all the way back to 1989, and I think in 1989, 63% of Americans said that global warming was a serious problem and the government should do something about it. I believe the most recent Gallup poll we looked at from March, it was at 65%. So despite the sense of all of this sort of volatility, what's remarkable is how incredibly stable it's been. Most Americans actually, since the very beginning, have believed that global warming was happening, would tell a pollster that it was a reasonably important issue and that the government should do something about it. And it has still, never been a particularly high priority, and well below, you can kind of cycle through the whole range of issues that have been sort of at the top of mind issues for the public since 1989, and global warming has never even approached that level and still doesn't.
And of course, the third factor that you would think would have changed public opinion on global warming is the fact that the doubters have been somewhat silenced, and that there is no longer this kind of, well, you can argue both sides of this issue. And at least journalism has stopped taking that on the one hand, on the other hand.
Not totally, actually. I mean, John Christie, who was on the IPCC and is a global warming skeptic, just had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and it got pretty widely picked up. But again, we don't really think that, we don't think that the global warming skeptics had that much of an impact. We think and in fact, by focusing so much on that, I think we've really overlooked that the big challenge at an opinion level is that people just don't care that much about global warming. But when you kind of follow that logic a little bit, rather than despairing, we kind of go, and of course the very literal reaction to it is to say, well, how do we make people care more about global warming? And it's like, it assumes that they need to. It's like literally goes, well, how could you possibly deal with global warming if you didn't talk about global warming and make your politics centrally about global warming? And this is the argument of the book, is we kind of go, people don't need to. You can actually mobilize so much more support for the kinds of actions and policies that we need by focusing on economic competitiveness globally and on energy independence, which are up there in the top 3 or 5 greatest issues of public support. I mean, when we did these focus groups and polling, people are just wild about needing to get off of oil. It's a huge priority. And they are very concerned about the economy, and people understand the role that innovation plays in the economy. So the centerpiece of the book, and it was even hinted at in the essay, was the key here is not making dirty energy more expensive. It's actually to make clean energy cheap. And the way that you make clean energy cheap directly is through technological innovation. That technology innovation is not happening. We're still using, coal is 300 years old. Oil is, over 100, we've been using it for over 100 years. Think about all the other technologies in our lives, and they're very new. Energy technologies are very old. There's no innovation happening, and there's reasons for it. And there's reasons, and the private sector isn't able to innovate in the energy sector. It needs to come from government. And so that's what the argument is, that we have to make these big federal investments to bring down the price. And when we do so, America will take a leadership role in accelerating these, and sort of taking a leadership role in these new clean energy markets, which are very fast-growing markets in the world, and we'll also free ourselves from oil. And those are far better arguments than global warming will ever be.
But controlling or raising the price of conventional energy as a way to spur innovation, you talk to a lot of people and a lot of investment people getting into clean tech, and they say what they need to move forward is some certainty that the price of oil is not going to drop below $50 a barrel or something like that.
Yeah.
And that there's a public mechanism to do that. Are you against that idea?
No, we've been very clear that we actually believe that there's a need for a regulatory framework to deal with to regulate carbon, and that we need to, in economic and market terms, we need to establish what economists call a price for carbon. What we take issue with is sort of the view that that in itself will be sufficient to drive the deep reductions in carbon emissions that we need to make over the next 50 years in the US and over the next century globally. That without a big technology push, and a lot of that is going to have to be publicly funded because it's stuff that the private sector does not do a very good job of and often just won't do because these are common investments, they're very long-term investments, they are often not particularly profitable in the short-term investments, or they involve sort of common infrastructure, things like a new electrical grid. So there's a whole set of big public investments we need to make such that clean energy technologies, even things like solar and wind, where wind is starting to come down to prices that start to look competitive in the US in particular contexts, but at a global context, scaled up at the massive level they would have to be scaled up to functionally replace fossil fuel, coal and oil. You have to still see dramatic breakthroughs in the cost and performance. And it's not only our view that simply establishing a price for carbon and a regulatory structure will be insufficient to do that. That's also the view. I mean, we went and reviewed the IPCC, the Stern review, the British government's review, a whole set of the other sort of major reviews of both the energy science and energy economics, and it's almost unanimous that there is a need for large-scale public investments to drive.
So it's not a question that these technologies are here, but they're just too expensive. You're saying these technologies, the technologies we need aren't here yet?
A lot of them are here.
Yeah, I mean, like, so for example, a lot of these technologies are here, but they have to have radical performance and price breakthroughs so that the price can come down. So solar right now is 5 to 10 times more expensive, than coal. In China, there's some estimates that it's double or triple that. So even if you can get like wind down to kind of competitive prices in the United States, you still have a number of other obstacles, like the windiest parts of the United States are not where the cities are. So you got to have big transmission lines. Or in the case of solar, you got to have, and also with wind, you got to have battery technologies that can store those new energy sources because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So our point is that, if you just set a price for carbon, essentially, if you just make dirty energy a little bit more expensive, solar is not going to become cost competitive that way. It's just too much more expensive. And so you could try to really dramatically increase electricity prices, but then you'll have a backlash from policymakers and the public. So our point is that the only way to kind of cut that Gordian knot is through large strategic investments.
Mm-hmm. One of my son came home, I have a high school freshman, and he came home the other day, and he was performing this carbon footprint audit, and he was going through and like, how many miles do we drive every week? How many, times do we go shopping and all this kind of stuff? And then he went to this computer program on the web, and he printed out, and he says, well, if everybody in the world lived the way we do, we would need 5 more worlds. I'm sure you're familiar with this website. And there is this question, of course, of China. We'll use that as our synecdoche for the whole problem. And you're basically, you say in the book, very clear cut, that if dealing with global warming comes at a cost to growth in a place like China, but I think it goes for India and other places as well, it's simply not going to happen. Right. And so that Americans are left in the awkward position of saying, well, they can't ever live the way we do because the world, we would need 4 more worlds.
Right. That is awkward.
We'll talk about that.
Awkward for us, of course, Yeah, I mean, we still hear when we go out, we hear it all the time. People go, we hear 1 or 2 things. People go, well, you guys construct a straw man. Environmentalists aren't really in a politics of limits. And then the next thing they'll say is, but the rest of the world can't live like we live. And of course, it's like, the rest of the world isn't asking our permission. China and India aren't asking our permission to burn a lot of coal and oil, just like we didn't ask them for their permission when we did so, or as we do so. And the second part of it is that, of course, it's like we've been, people have been predicting that humans are going to run out of food ever since the early 19th century. And of course, the calculations they make weren't wrong they were based on current technologies. So yeah, if agriculture didn't become more productive, then we would have run out of food. But obviously that's not happened. And the same thing with energy. It's, yes, we would need 5 more worlds if we continue to burn coal and oil, if that's how everybody gets their energy. Hence the need to move as quickly as we can to new energy sources. And I guess what we worry a little bit about with that logic is it takes you to a fairly small place. You kind of go, I mean, that's what the politics of limits does, is it kind of gets you, well, how can I make myself smaller? And how can I have other people consume less? Well, there's some people in the world that need to consume more. The Chinese consume about 15 to 20% of the energy that we consume per capita. We're certainly in no position to tell them they shouldn't be consuming that energy. They need to consume more energy. So you come to a much more expansive place when you kind of go, what sort of opportunities emerge when we think of this as sort of a global investment partnership, where the US puts in like $500 billion over 10 years, Europe puts in $500 billion over 10 years, and you got like $1 trillion. Now you're talking about some real money, And we point out that there's like a single factory in China that produces a quarter of all PV. At least this is what Danny Kennedy told me, who's here. He can correct me if that's wrong. That's like one factory in China. And you kind of go, what could 500 of those factories? Will you tell us what
PV is, too?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's photovoltaic solar panels. And you kind of go, well, if you have a situation where, we're in a situation now where, the United Nations met like a month ago, and it ended with no action on global warming. And one of the diplomats kind of afterwards told the Associated Press, he said, boy, I don't know how we'll ever get action on global warming because these countries continue to prioritize economic development more than global warming. I just felt like strangling the guy. It's like, well, of course, you have to get action on global warming by going through a kind of economic development. So you kind of go, if you have $1 trillion on the table, what kind of a global partnership in terms of manufacturing solar, in terms of bringing down the price of wind, in terms of electrifying the globe and new battery technologies, what could you get? And at that sort of a deal, China might be willing to put some pollution limits on. They're going to get a lot of manufacturing jobs out of this. I think the United States might feel more optimistic about being engaged with a country like China if we could see the benefits to our engineers and scientists. So our point is sort of like a politics of possibility has to have investment at the center because that's what creates economic opportunity.
Well, it certainly sounds better, and I think it would feel better than telling anyone that they can't have a consumer economy and all the goodies that we have, and they could eat meat the way we eat. But it's one thing to say that that's what we need to do politically to sell it, and another to say, is this actually possible to do? The fact is, I don't know that we have a model of economic growth that doesn't correlate very tightly with much more increased CO2 emissions, right? I mean, so far, that's how we know how to grow. That's how we know to have a consumer economy. Is there any reason to believe that you could achieve similar levels of consumer utopia without that?
Well, I think that.
I mean, I see it as a political matter, but let's talk about it as a technical matter.
As a technical matter, I think first of all, I think there is, we have a lot of the technologies we need. Again, they are not at the level in terms of cost and performance to do what we need them to do yet, and we don't have the infrastructure in place to support it. But just at an energy level, it is not at all unthinkable that we might not be able to see dramatic increases in energy use. We're gonna see it with dramatic reductions in carbon emissions if we move to really disruptive energy technologies, solar, wind. There's a variety of others. And that's not to say that we're going to sort of wave a magic wand and do that. We're going to do that by making big investments. We're going to do it by making shared investments.
Is it going to be open source technology?
Well, I don't know if it's going to be open source, but what's clear is that there's going to be a lot of technology spillover, which is also one of the reasons why sort of depending on private sector investment to innovate in the energy sector is particularly problematic because for a variety of reasons, the energy technologies are particularly vulnerable to spillover, which means that private firms have a difficult time recovering the full value of the investments that they make in a lot of these technologies. So you're going to see, at an energy level. Now, I think you raise an important point, which is, well, let's just get beyond energy. Let's look at sort of, we're already sort of, fishing our oceans into, oblivion. And when you look at, meat, production of meat, a variety of other things, and just sort of a general consumption economy, what do you do with that? And, again, on one level, I think that obviously there's a whole set of resources that clearly we can and need to be managing much better, for instance, our oceans. Secondly, I don't think that it's unreasonable
Which is a matter of regulation and traditional environmental tools?
Regulation, traditional environmental tools. There's also increasing models of sort of, providing some sort of ownership. A lot of the most successful fishery models give sort of fishermen in the industry some sort of ownership stake in the resource, so they have a long-term stake in perpetuating it. But then I think the other questions around consumption, I mean, obviously, it's not, I think, unreasonable to expect that we may see, significant breakthroughs in material sciences and things like that allow us to use resources, a whole variety of other resources, a lot more efficiently, both in terms of being able to recycle them and also being able to produce them with a lot less impact. And then I think, one of the arguments that we make in the book is to recognize that increasing numbers of Americans, I mean, the value that we call ecological concern is a function of material prosperity. And that as people move from sort of materialism to post-materialism, we see a sort of rising concern for the environment. And that's not just a political concern, but it also starts to change the way that people consume. There's a point at which, psychologically and otherwise, people sort of start focusing on, there's a period where it's sort of like the more stuff I have, the better I'm doing. And then there's a period where people kind of go, actually, I don't live better with more stuff. And I think, one of the transformations that, in a consumer culture is critical in a society like ours, where really we are just, the level of abundance that we live in is truly remarkable, is how we start to kind of create a consumer culture that actually becomes as good at providing us sort of meeting post-material needs as it is at meeting material needs. So,
but is there any evidence that people get sufficiently materially comfortable that their carbon emissions go down? Have we seen that happen? I know certain other pollutants go down.
Well, it's hard for them to go down. I mean, most people aren't willing to, when they reach a certain level of prosperity, they don't want it to decline. But you do find, obviously, in places like, in some of the most affluent communities in the United States, people choose not to accumulate more materialism, but to actually try to achieve their fulfillment in other ways. But if you don't have new energy, if you don't have cleaner energy sources coming online, they're not going to go down in emissions.
I think it's reasonable. Energy use probably will continue to increase. But in terms of the overall sort of ecological footprint, I think there are all sorts of ways, from people choosing to live in denser communities to consuming. I mean, if you just look, I don't know who here knows what Second Life is. Second Life, well, I wish I could really explain it, but I have to confess I don't even fully understand it. I don't get it.
I'm sure there are people in this room who do.
Apparently, there's a whole online economy now where it's all stuff that is bought and sold virtually. And people's online identities become as powerful and as real to them as their sort of here and now and sitting in this room identities. And what happens when more and more of our we consume more and more virtually? I mean, there's a whole set of trends that actually run. I mean, like I said, I don't get it, but somebody's doing this, and I think it's not unreasonable. There's a whole set of, when you look at sort of growing trends and the way that folks live, and of course, often we complain about this. We kind of go, these kids, they spend all their time playing video games and they're never out in nature. But actually, if you follow some of the entailments of that sort of all the way through, it suggests that people may start consuming in completely, vastly different ways that don't require you to manufacture something in a factory.
And when we can download our personalities onto silicon, we will use very little carbon.
Exactly.
I don't know if I look forward to that. So I don't
know if I do either, but
But we're kind of in this race to raise the world standard of living and hopefully be able to do it using less energy. I mean, that's the challenge you're setting, and I guess.
Well, no, it's actually, if I could just rephrase, it's actually by decoupling energy consumption from emissions, right? Because I mean, energy consumption is going to increase. It's going to double or triple or maybe quadruple by the end of the century. So it's really a matter of allowing people to increase their energy, allowing the Chinese and the Indians and really the developing world to increase energy use without it creating more greenhouse gas emissions.
I'd like to I'd like to open this up to a few questions. I've got a few more, but I'd like to hear from the audience now if people have got any questions they'd like to ask. We didn't make arrangements for a microphone, so I'm just going to repeat your questions. Why don't you go first?
One of the energy technologies that one hears a lot about in developing countries is nuclear. Now, there are obviously lots of arguments pro and con. One of the pro-nuclear arguments is that it limits, if not, well, it reduces significantly greenhouse gas emissions for the kilowatt hour produced. I'm wondering what your sense is of how nuclear is going to play out. I mean, the French are going full speed ahead with it. It's starting to appear as a possibility in Africa and Asia. And I'd just like to hear.
Did everybody? Was there people able to hear that? The question was about nuclear energy and how that fits into your vision of low emission energy source.
Well, I'll tell you, we both came up sort of, in the environmental movement and with the sort of strong anti-nuke perspective. And I have to say, having, just reading the energy science and energy economics literature, it's really hard to find any serious mainstream review of how you get from here to 80% reduction in carbon that doesn't include some pretty significant role for nuclear. And I think it's, even a lot of traditional environmentalists are really sort of rethinking their opposition to nukes, including, among others, Bill McKibben recently sort of put that back on the table as something that, and I think as opposed to the late 70s and 80s when at least when I kind of sort of came into contact with the anti-nuclear movement, I mean, the stakes have kind of changed. I mean, back then and even still now, where we're talking about worrying about what the impacts of nuclear waste are going to be, if it kind of leaks out of Yucca Mountain or wherever you put it, 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000 years from now, we're talking about 100, 200, 300 timelines where year of time frame where we're potentially seeing radical changes to the climate that are going to have dramatic impacts on the climate, but more significantly, extraordinarily disruptive impacts on human societies and human settlement, and it sort of starts to change, I think, the perspective, and I think that's why a lot of folks are at least taking a second look at it. Now, the flip side of that, I think, while the environmental movement has been sort of focused on cap and trade, the nuclear industry went and got their big public investment in nukes in the 2005 energy bill, $10 billion, and I think they're coming back for more, to kind of essentially buy down the price of the first 7 or 10 next generation nuclear plants. And this, of course, actually is the model that we think we need to be looking at for things like solar and other alternative technologies. So I think my view, wherever you kind of come out on the desirability and efficacy of nukes, if you're serious about not wanting nukes to be a big part of the equation, you had better go we had better go get those big investments in the alternatives, or I think we are going to have a lot of nukes.
We've had a taste. I'll get to your question in a second. We've had a taste of a big public initiative behind an alternative energy, the one, I think, besides nukes that the Bush administration has pursued, and that, of course, is ethanol.
Which is your favorite, right?
My favorite. With the initiative in the 2006, I guess, State of the Union message, and a new subsidy, essentially 51 cents a gallon, plus a tariff on imported, and we've had this rush of investment. I mean, this isn't public investment so much, but there's some public investment, but basically a structure of incentives was created to drive a lot of public investment, private investment into ethanol plants, and now the growing of huge amounts of corn. Is this a model for what you're talking about? I mean, whatever the virtues of corn-based ethanol or not, but is that the kind of thing you look to the government to start doing?
Well, there is a way in which some of it is a model. I mean, the problem with corn-based ethanol, of course, is that it's not, you don't get the benefits. I mean, one of the problems with it is that you don't get the greenhouse gas emissions reductions like you get, that we think we'll get from cellulosic ethanol, right? The better kinds of ethanol, or that Brazil gets from.
Explain why that is.
Boy, I thought you could explain why that is. Or from sugarcane ethanol.
Well, because it takes so much fossil fuel to make the ethanol, because you need all the fossil fuel to grow the corn and to dry the corn and then transport the corn and then the distillation process, which requires a lot of energy also. So
and
by
like
the end,
switchgrass and sugarcane can be grown without all those heavy.
yeah, but
carbon
switchgrass
inputs.
can't yet be turned into
Ethanol.
Right.
ethanol.
Right.
Sugarcane can, but anyway.
But yeah, so the point is that, like, I mean, so the argument, the traditional argument against this kind of big investments like that is that the government shouldn't be picking winners or losers, right? That should be left to the market, which is we criticize in the book as a kind of market fundamentalism. And we point out that the government is always picking winners and losers. Really, the government's been picking coal and oil, and lately they've been picking corn-based ethanol. And the government makes all sorts of bad decisions, but it also makes a number of really good decisions, right? So we point out that, you know, we didn't get to the personal computer by banning typewriters. You know, we just, you know, I know that sounds obvious, but, you know, in the late 1950s, microchips were really expensive. They were $1,000 a chip, and the Defense Department knew it needed microchips to do the space, you know, the space race with the Soviet Union and the computer race with the Cold War. So they just bought down the price of microchips. I mean, literally, they had done it before with radio in Silicon Valley, and they did it again with microchips. Then, you know, the internet was also not invented by banning telegraphs and fax machines. It was done. It was literally, the internet was invented in a Defense Department laboratory. So so for every kind of corn-based ethanol that you could present, I could go and tell a story about microchips and the internet. Obviously, there's like the terrible Osprey helicopters, a big boondoggle in the Defense Department, but there's also more effective technologies. So I don't think it's an argument for not having a technology policy or not having big investments.
No, I agree.
Just like
I think
some
the challenge
regulations are bad too.
The challenge is, how do you get those decisions to be made in a way that isn't completely corrupt?
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of support for ethanol by and large, because it challenges the least number of interests in this. You know, it's another liquid to put in the vehicles and have in the gas stations. But if it doesn't, you know, So how do you put the money into something that doesn't immediately have interest groups supporting it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, as Michael was saying, I mean, this is an argument not for not having a public technology policy. It's an argument for getting really, really serious about public technology policy and putting as much resources into fighting those battles and fighting them well as we put into the regulatory battles, and as much thought about how to do it and to do it right and to get the politics right. And I think that you know, clearly there's a whole set of things. You know, first of all, probably, you know, if we're going to go spend 30 billion or 50 billion a year in clean energy investment, we're not going to spend it all well. I mean, you know, this is an imperfect democracy at best, and there are lots of powerful interests, and there are just lots of bad decisions that get made, and there's good decisions, and part of the challenge here is to just make enough of these bets and have a large enough pie that that you're not constantly sort of making these sort of Hobson choices between you know, one promising technology and another, or you got enough where, you know, ethanol is not going to go, and clean coal aren't going to go eat it all up. So I think that's one thing, and then the other thing is you know, we do have a whole range of models for how you actually set up public investment policies to at least somewhat insulate them.
Well, in
from,
medicine, for example.
Yeah, exactly. We have NIH. You know, another example of this was the military base closing process, where, you know, there were recommendations that went to Congress that Congress could vote up or down but couldn't amend. There's, I believe, John Deutsch, who was a former Secretary of Energy, has proposed a public, you know, what would essentially be a public corporation that would sort of drive these investments. So, and frankly, what's interesting is how little serious intellectual work has been done to figure this stuff out and figure out how to do it. And you can read all of the literature, and everyone agrees that we need to make these big public investments. But there's just been very little sort of focus or resources that have gone to really thinking it through.
One of the things, though, a question that comes up in your book, and I'll get to your, I promise, as soon as I finish this one, is creating incentives also for increases in efficiency and conservation. I mean, with all the hoopla you read about ethanol, one of the most striking statistics I came across is that for all the benefit that ethanol is supposed to give us, this current program, to get it up to the levels the administration wants to get it to by 2015, you could get all of that benefit in terms of global, in terms of emissions by a 1 mile per gallon increase in fuel efficiency of our cars. 1 mile per gallon, this entire ethanol thing, equals that. There's clearly so much more money to be done in, an ethanol boondoggle than raising. So isn't there a place for that sort of regulation that can have such a dramatic effect?
Absolutely, and some of the big breakthroughs or the big gains in terms of emissions reductions from efficiency and conservation will come from having some pollution limits. Even some modest ones will be an incentive to firms to essentially, retrofit buildings. I think the other thing, it's important to remember that, the stuff around fuel efficiency, and this is what we wrote about in the original essay, is that, we've failed politically on it for year after year after year. I mean, fuel economy rates have gone down over the last 20 years. And Anne-Marie Lovins, wrote this very famous paper in 1976 arguing for moving away from, kind of what he called the hard energy to a sort of a soft energy paths, basically laying out much of the same technical solutions that he still talks about. And meanwhile, emissions have gone up and our fossil fuel consumption has gone up.
Although the amount of growth we get for every unit of energy has also gone up dramatically. I mean,
that's right.
There was a statistic I read in some of the clips about you that said that we're getting 3 times as much gross domestic product from every BTU, essentially, that we're using, which
Absolutely.
is pretty amazing, since 1970.
But our dependency on oil has also gone up. So yeah, you're getting more efficiency in some ways just as a process of technological progress. I mean, I think there's also a political point here, though, too, which is that, they may get some we may be able to get some fuel economy increases through Congress right now. It's actually in conference committee, and there's still big opposition to it in Congress. We have a point in the book that we make, which was sort of like the inspiration of the original essay, which was that we started talking to environmental leaders about, the fuel economy challenge. Could you actually try to do some sort of a deal with Detroit automakers, which have been the obstacle to raising fuel economy standards, where we agree to sort of help cover their healthcare costs, which their Japanese and European auto, competitors don't have, because they, at least for their plants, abroad, because they have national healthcare, in exchange for higher fuel economy standards. And we were told by environmental leaders, well, we're not in the business of doing industrial policy, and we can't be.
So
we're not a labor union.
This is part of your objection to environmentalism as defined, right? That it narrows its focus.
That's
and
right.
It doesn't feel healthcare is not our issue, energy policy is not necessarily our issue, and I gather, am I putting words in your mouth? That's why you're rejecting this term, and that we need.
That's right. And then when you go and define just a whole set of things inside that box of the environment, and my job is to represent that box. And if the solutions to it may exist outside the box, then you've got a big problem. I mean, it's the classic bureaucratic mindset, and the problem is not the bureaucrats, the problem is the box itself.
Well, and it's not just, a sort of bureaucrats sort of narrowly defining their job. We said in the original essay that environmentalism had become a special interest. Right. And what we meant was that, environmentalists have tended to think of the environment and nature as these things separate to us, and then they go construct the politics around it where they literally try to speak for or represent it in politics. And we make the case that this causes all sorts of problems, both at a policy level and politically. At a policy level, it sort of leads you to define that box really narrowly and specifically. And if it doesn't have to do with protecting nature or the environment, then it's someone else's job. And at a political level, it's why we keep getting into these sort of pitched battles where the environment and the economy and other sort of human needs keep getting juxtaposed against one, in these sort of oppositional relationships, because of course, when you define what you're doing as representing the interests of nature, sort of what clear is against human activities, then why would we act, surprised when those things end up and oppositionally, and when we keep losing those battles when that happens.
We've been talking a lot about policy, but some of the most interesting material in the book is addressing these more philosophical questions about how we've tended to frame our relationship to nature and to see it as other, and to see ourselves as existing in a zero-sum relationship with it. And I think that's some of the best stuff in the book. You were very patiently waiting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Could you say something about the Apollo Alliance, and also, in particular, how that stands in relation to the presidential candidates?
Sure.
And tell us about the Apollo Alliance. The question was about the Apollo Alliance, and tell us what it is for those of us who don't know what it is.
Well, so in 2002, Ted and I were sort of reading. I mean, we were already becoming a bit frustrated with some of the stuff that we've been describing.
Where were you working then, and what were you?
Well, I had been sort of a consultant to the big environmental groups, as had Ted, and then in 2002 we had sort of been reading so much about global warming that we realized that there was a big technology innovation and investment need. And so we've co-founded this thing called the Apollo Alliance that was calling for a new Apollo project, sort of a big investment in clean energy that was sort of metaphorically tied to the moonshot. We pointed out that, that Kennedy gets up and makes that speech in 1962, and he says, it's going to be hard, not easy, and it's going to be expensive, not cheap, and God damn it, it's going to test the best of our abilities. And that was the right attitude to deal with clean energy and global warming. So we sort of did what you're supposed to do, which is you kind of round up everybody to endorse it. So we got the labor unions to endorse it, we got the big environmental groups to endorse it around 2003, and then basically had no other support beyond that. In fact, Ted and I were actually asked to withdraw Apollo legislation from Congress. A congressman from Seattle had introduced it, very good congressman, and environmentalists were worried that it would get in the way or confuse their efforts to kill the Bush energy bill, which of course went on to pass a couple years later anyway. And then in 2004, we lobbied Kerry and other presidential candidates very hard. We actually sent a bunch of young people dressed up in spacesuit costumes to Iowa, these jumpsuits, and it was an amazing time because Kerry is before he went to the nomination in Iowa, he sees a bunch of these young people in the audience, and he goes, and I see the young kids from the Apollo Alliance, and he goes, they've got the right idea, we've got to invent our way out of this. And it was just like, we have it on video actually, and you're watching John Kerry and you're like, my God, who is this guy? This guy's great, You're like, what happened to him, And no, seriously, and we watched this, and then we spent that, after he gets the nomination, we really lobbied the Kerry campaign very hard. We actually went and hired his pollster as an effort to influence him. I'm serious, that's how it works. It's an ugly game. And obviously none of that worked, and we were told, we've got, 4 boxes: the economy, foreign policy, energy independence, and healthcare. And Apollo fits in the energy independence box. And we were like, well, no, Apollo is like a story of American greatness. It's about what we're good at. It's about innovation and about dreaming and about inventing. And they were like, no, it belongs in the energy independence box. And so we were getting frustrated about that, and that was part of our motivation to write The Death of Environmentalism. It was like there's something wrong when people are looking at Apollo and they like steadfastly resist its power. And then we wrote Death of Environmentalism. We promptly get fired from the Apollo Alliance, which was of course a total blessing. And it's a tricky thing because of course you try to go get the established interest groups to endorse this visionary thing, and of course they don't want you to go and really push any legislation that's different from what they're doing. I mean, in the book we talk about this a bit, that the older industrial unions are really much more concerned about protecting the jobs that we have, not creating the new high-tech clean energy jobs. It's just a different set of activities. But and we were still pretty despairing about the possibility of the presidential candidates actually picking this up. But and Hillary had called for $50 billion for clean energy. John Edwards called for $13 billion a year, or $130 billion over 10 years. And then when we started our book tour, Barack Obama called for $150 billion over 10 years. And so we were starting to feel like, wow, I mean, all the second-tier Democratic candidates have called for like $500 trillion a year or something. But and that's great, but it does feel like, there's been some progress since that's happened. We're feeling really good about that. Again, it feels like the environmental movement is still, they kind of look at that investment stuff, they're like, yeah, but how much are we going to make, what are the pollution limits that we're going to impose? And it was sort of, we think, really missing the big game that's over here.
Well, this brings up a point that I wanted to raise, which is, and this is to raise the straw man,
right.
which is
Thank you
that
for calling the straw man.
that I'm reading a lot of the response to your book and reading environmentalists, and it seems to me that there is not the kind of hostility to investment, and there is more of that this particular challenge has brought forth some fresher thinking. And you mentioned Bill McKibben, who also seems very, very supportive of a large-scale investment in alternative energies. And Carl Pope, who was one of your detractors first time around, wrote a long piece on Grist, I guess, on the website, where too he also was. So to what extent are you pushing on an open door here?
Well, that is a good point. I mean, I think there's a lot that's changed and there's a lot that hasn't changed. And so if you just look at, where the Democratic presidential candidates are, I mean, they have come, a vast direction. And the environmental movement has come too, to the point where, I mean, it's funny, on some of this stuff, they're almost backing into the public investment piece of it, because it's sort of like, first we got a cap, and then we have to demand that all of the permits be auctioned. And then suddenly we have like $1 trillion that we got to figure out what to do with. Oh, well, let's spend it on clean energy. And I think you're right that there is an openness. Now, I think at times we still sort of look at that and kind of go, well, let's watch what people are doing and not what they're saying. And it sort of looks to us like most of the resources are still going in. There's a sense that we'll go get a cap and trade system and we'll worry about this public investment piece later. And I think our view is that we need to take the public investment piece every bit as seriously as we take the regulatory strategy, that we need to put the same kind of investment and the same seriousness. I mean, as I was saying earlier, no one's even, we have literally hundreds and hundreds of attorneys and scientists in Washington who have spent their entire careers figuring out how to draft the regs for a cap and trade system. And in fact, they are having vicious arguments between each other about exactly how to do it. We have almost nobody who has actually given thought to how you actually go create the politics and the policies necessary to do public investment right. And if you want to know where the real priorities of the movement are, go look at that, because I think it's still completely out of whack with with the challenge we're faced with. So on the one hand, I want to acknowledge that actually the investment stuff is being taken a lot more seriously now than it has been in a very, very long time. And that's really promising. And there's still a long way to go, just sort of institutionally and conceptually. And I particularly worry that if if a cap and trade, serious cap and trade stuff moves quickly, we're actually going to be completely unprepared to make sure that the money that it raises is spent the way we need to spend.
So is that the assumption of where the money comes from?
I want to say something about this. Is such a key point, and it does require a little bit of technical understanding of how this works. Okay, so the money. So what happens is that you put a limit on the amount of pollution in the whole economy, and then firms have to buy essentially their right to pollute, and they're called pollution permits or pollution rights or whatever, and then the total amount goes down, right? And then the value of those goes up, and firms can trade those back and forth, whoever gets the best. But the key thing to remember here is that, the money that the firms are going to have to spend in either moving to cleaner energy sources or on efficiency or conservation or a whole other set of means are just going to be passed down to us. So there's a little we have our friends in the environmental, some of our friends in the environmental movement, or even at other organizations will say things like, don't let the corporations get off the hook. The corporations will have to pay this, but the corporations will pass all of those costs down to us. Nobody even, that's
you mean in the cost of goods and things?
In the cost of goods, but also your electricity bill and the cost of gasoline. And we're not against that. That's we think that we should have to do that. But but our community is not being honest about that. And there's a problem when you're not totally transparent and honest about it, and it's that our opponents then get to introduce that fact to the American public through some very good and funny television ads. I mean, think of the Harry and Louise ad. I mean, imagine you're a creative director at a big ad agency and what you could do with that. You scare the bejesus out of people, like they did in November of last year when they got people to vote against that ballot initiative. So our point is that how do you get Americans? So the money can, well, first of all, so the money can either come from raising electricity prices or gasoline prices, or we can just pay for more in taxes. Right, but the money doesn't come from nowhere. It's not going to come out of the CEO's salary. Right. They make a lot of money. They don't make that much money, right? So you have to figure out a way. How do you get Americans to get behind this? And this is where the whole philosophical and political argument, kind of coming back to where we started. It's like we don't think that you're going to get Americans to pay more for that stuff, either in their electricity and energy, or for in taxes, in a politics that's about avoiding global warming apocalypse. We think that you're going to get there through a vision and a message that's positive, that says this is what it's going to take to free ourselves once and for all from oil. This is going to be about an investment in our future, about creating millions of new jobs, about global competitiveness. It's got to be really sold in that big aspirational way. Otherwise, Americans aren't going to buy it. And that's why we're dramatizing the need to get this out of preventing global warming and into creating the new energy future.
And just one last thing, I know there's a bunch of questions, but like at the point at which you have like legislation, you're going to go pass a policy that's going to raise $100 billion to invest in the energy sector of the economy every year. I'm not sure that you can really, it makes much sense to continue to think about that and characterize it as a pollution and energy regulatory policy. This is a full-blown industrial policy and public investment policy, and we'd be well served to understand it that way conceptually, both in terms of understanding what the policy challenges are, and also in terms of how we're going to go actually explain what the hell we're doing to the American public.
In the back, yes.
When you guys were talking earlier, you were saying that there's the potential to have a $500 billion investment by the United States, a $500 billion investment by Europe, and then it would be a partnership with the developing world in which there would be manufacturing would be spread all around. And then what I'm hearing now is more along the lines of the Apollo project, as the U.S. making this is an enterprise, something to grow American jobs. And so what I'm wondering is it the Apollo project or is it the Marshall Plan? Is this we're going to create jobs for for America, and this is going to be America, and then it's going to disseminate or trickle down or whatever you want to call it, or is this we're going to create a partnership globally, and we're going to pour out money with the intent of creating a better world? A, which one would you like to see happen, and B, which one would you see as feasible?
All right, great question. Yeah, I mean, so in the book what we argue is that ultimately this is not going to be sold, at least not initially, as a global strategy. I mean, it's really going to be about American jobs, American energy independence. But I think that this is why it really does require national leadership. Somebody has to really be able to explain this over a period of time to people. You have to be able to get people in a place, and this is where, just in case you have the wrong idea, this book is not a technical book. In fact, much of the technical debates that we've had have been offline. I mean, what the argument that we make really is that when Americans get into a place where we feel optimistic about the future, where we feel secure about American power and American leadership, that Americans then feel more generous and they start to see more win-win opportunities. So we think that sort of, maybe it starts as the new Apollo project, but then kind of becomes kind of a global Marshall Plan. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I would just say, the reality is that however these investments start, we're not going to change the basic realities of the globalized economy and the realities of trying to manufacture in places like the U.S. The amount of manufacturing you're going to do here is always going to be somewhat limited, and it's always going to be, or not always, but for the foreseeable future, it's going to be a lot cheaper to do it other places. So, already a quarter of the world's photovoltaic panels are being manufactured in China. As you make big improvements and start to scale these technologies up, a lot of that manufacturing is going to help elsewhere. But there are still huge economic benefits to actually pioneering these industries, being a first mover and establishing sort of the technological leadership, that even as manufacturing jobs go elsewhere, there's still enormous economic. I mean, we don't manufacture computers in the US for the most part anymore either, but there's still enormous economic value that came from sort of really being a leader in that to the US economy. So, it's a little bit of a both, it's sort of both and the reality is that in the long term, we believe that the only way you see you sort of significantly change the trajectory of emissions in places like China and India is to get the real unsubsidized cost of clean energy down to a point where it really is a viable alternative to all of the very dirty coal that they're going to burn now to drive their development. So in the long term, it's not going to be sustainable to attempt to sort of literally on an ongoing basis subsidize China and India to use energy technologies that are significantly more expensive than the ones that they have readily available now.
Yes?
Eventually there's a question at the end of this comment. In some ways this conversation sort of does a disservice to the book. I mean, you guys are obviously policy wonks with the best of them in discussing, all the minutiae of these things. But to a large extent, the book is sort of a philosophical tract. I mean, the closest it comes down to earth is, in sort of the George Lakoff reframing tradition, but it discusses all kinds of political philosophy. And ultimately it says, we need a new politics. And I'd feel a lot better if we had even one example of where this new politics is. Isn't this just another utopianism? Which you, of course, say is not a bad thing, but a lot of rigorous,
Right.
Everybody hear the question? Well, the question is really, there's something very utopian about this, that you're calling for nothing less than a whole new politics. And do we have any examples, I guess, you can point to showing the possibility, either historically or somewhere else in the world today, of this actually happening?
Well, the examples that we point to are historical, and we point out that really where we look for inspiration are not to the past efforts to regulate pollution. There are things like, the invention of personal computers, the internet, sort of the creation of Silicon Valley. We also talk, without giving away the ending, so you all still have to buy, because it is sort of a mystery. There is at the end, we do talk a bit about what is that sort of, about sort of why did that Marshall Plan work and how did that make sense, and really that it was big investments in energy. But I think your point is also pointing to something, there's a way in which we just have sort of forgotten all this. I mean, literally, the problem that the iceberg that we're trying to burn through with this little philosophical polemic we've written is really about that when we go to talk to our colleagues that are in the environmental movement, or really any of the movements that we work in, it's like people have forgotten that government has a very important role to play, and that there's a role to play for very large public investments. And so some of this is an effort to kind of remind people of that, because it's just like the assumption with everybody that we deal with is that all of this stuff is easier to get done with regulation, easier to get done politically with new regulation than it is with investment, despite sort of the incredible successes that we've had with investment.
I just want to go to I think you're asking a larger question, which is when we talk about a new politics, what is it that what are the examples of sort of moving out of what we call this kind of complaint-based politics of limits that has really sort of taken hold not only of environmentalism, but much of the sort of progressive democratic left in America, where we go and we have a whole chapter where we kind of critique what was a wildly popular book, What's the Matter with Kansas, because it suggests that the problem here is that we just haven't gone and reminded Kansans that they're poor victims who need to sort of rise up against their corporate taskmasters and sort of put their material self-interest at the center of their politics. And we point out that Kansans are rich. They're not poor by any historical or global perspective. They've actually gotten their material needs largely met, which is why they're no longer making basic calculations about their material self-interest in their politics, and they've moved on to a whole set of what we describe as post-material concerns. And we think there's a whole way in which actually the right has much more effectively recognized this, whether it's through the new, the ways in which new evangelical churches have sort of both serve to meet all sorts of post-material needs and then translate those into a quite regressive politics in the ways in which a whole set of the sort of discourse of modern conservatism has sort of recognized the way that Americans' aspirations are changing, even as in other ways they're quite reactionary in the ways in which they still put sort of the individual at the center of politics in what is an increasingly individualistic society. And that's not just sort of something that's happened here in the US, but it's a global feature of modernization and development, is a rising sort of orientation towards sort of me as the individual and what do I want. And we point to all of the ways in which our sort of democratic progressive politics really has not significantly sort of renovated itself to recognize the ways in which Americans are experiencing the world in vastly different ways than they were in the 1960s, much less the 1930s, where a whole lot of our policy orthodoxies and political orthodoxies sort of arose from and haven't really changed much. So what does a progressive politics look like when we acknowledge that we're a wealthy society, we're not poor? That most people most Americans are quite autonomous and are actually sort of pursuing all sorts of post-material needs. What does that politics look like? Now, we don't have all the answers. In fact, we have few of them, but we're at least trying to sort of raise a set of questions that we think kind of get in the way of sort of telling Americans a story that actually makes sense to them in terms of their lives and the lives that they aspire to live. And in that sense, the book isn't, there's no 10-point plan. There's, we're not, I think we've become accustomed to, or particularly sort of liberals, I think, often have become accustomed to books that kind of tell them what to do at the end, and we don't really do that, for better or worse. So,
time for a couple more questions. Yes, the woman. Yeah, there.
I'm just curious what you two think about how, in your new political future, we're going to sort of internalize market externalities such as environmental impact, and also you mentioned that Americans are getting wealthier, but the poverty gap is also increasing. So these other sorts of market externalities, how do they fit in through the investment in public research?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things on that. I mean, the first is that the language of sort of internalizing externalities, I mean, it's, I have a bit of a problem with it, just in the sense that it assumes that there's like this kind of pure market that exists, and the funny thing we point out in the book is that, whereas environmentalists sort of like naturalize nature, that, like free market fundamentalists kind of naturalize the market. So there's like this natural market, and then we sort of distort it in all sorts of ways. And we point out that we create markets. We create the rules for the markets. We, through everything from our tax code to our social policy, we're rewarding and punishing various actors in the marketplace. So I think the way that we've been thinking about it is, a slightly different way, which is how do we construct, new markets that achieve the kind of things that we want to achieve. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I just, on some level, I mean, this gets to the same point, but, we've always externalized, from practically, the sort of beginning of human societies in one way or another, we've sort of externalized the, many of the sort of costs, the ecological costs associated with our development, and we're still doing that, and I think it's more useful to sort of think about what social ends do we want markets to serve, and so how should we construct them so that they serve that? I mean, we point out in the book that, and this is really our attack on market fundamentalists, that, even the most sort of extreme market fundamentalists would not argue that it's okay for you to kill your economic competitor, because,
literally.
Literally,
yeah.
Yes. So, here is a human constraint on on the market that, of course, almost everybody accepts. And in fact, markets function because we constrain them in a whole variety of ways to constrict the outcomes or to promote particular outcomes. So, when we look at, say, transitioning into a clean energy economy, we're not creating a perfect market or creating a pure market. We're just creating a market that will better deliver that outcome as opposed to the outcome that we're getting now, which is a lot of energy use and a lot of economic growth, but also a lot of carbon in the atmosphere and a whole set of impacts from that we've decided are not going to be beneficial to the survival of human societies.
I'm going to take one more question, and I'm going to take it from you.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to return to your issue about global warming being like 12th on the priority list of Americans. It's always been my feeling that one of the reasons for that is that we tend to be crisis-oriented and very short-term oriented in terms of our priorities, and to say that something is going to be a big deal 20 years from now or 25 years from now never makes it. If the human race was going to be extinct in the next 30 days because of global warming, it would be number one on the priority list. I'm sure of that. And somehow we seem to have survived that through previous crises. That mentality, the human race hasn't gone extinct. We always find a way out before it gets to that point. And there's a sort of general feeling that maybe this is the time when that isn't going to work. That if we don't solve it when it's still 20, 30 years away, when it's 6 months away, it's going to be too late to solve it. Right. I get some sense that your approach is to try to get out of that by not focusing on how bad global warming is, but instead focusing how good some alternatives can be. But I'm wondering if you see...
Are there times where fear is a good motivator? I mean, we've had a government for 8 years that's operated on the politics of fear with great success.
And look at what you get.
Yeah.
We make that point. I mean, one anecdote that we tell at the beginning of the book, in the essay, we were very famous for having said that Martin Luther King, Jr. didn't give the "I have a nightmare" speech. And we sort of said it.
Although it's an important part of that speech, as you also point out.
So
there is a nightmare in that.
And then in the book we kind of come back to it and we say, in the book we sort of open the book by trying to understand. We said, well, let's go back to that because everybody was talking about that. And we literally go and do the research and we figure out that King actually did sort of give an "I have a nightmare" speech. And the context was there's the March on Washington in 1963, and they were pushing for new civil rights legislation. And President Kennedy literally calls up King and says, "I want you to call off the march. We need success in Congress, not a big show in the Capitol, and you guys are going to alienate Southern conservative Democrats, and I want you to call it off." And then Kennedy promptly flew to Berlin, where he called for freedom for people living behind the Iron Curtain. And it really ticked off King. And he had been, traveling all around the South. He was traveling with this really amazing gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, the queen of gospel, maybe the greatest gospel singer. And she had been hearing King give riffs of the "I Have a Dream" speech. And so it comes time for her to sing before he speaks. And he says to her, "I want you to sing 'I've been buked and I've been scorned,'" which is a very dark, spiritual. And her manager goes, "You're going to have to sing something a little bit more uplifting than that," And King's like, "That's what I want." And so Mahalia sings it, and King, proceeds to stand up and give the darkest speech of his career. It was a speech about how, there was a debt that white America owed black America, that, there was a check came back, metaphorical check came back, returned to sender. And King basically threatening chaos and violence if they didn't get civil rights legislation. And King is losing the crowd. It's a hot day in August. And Mahalia, who's a performer, is reading the crowd. And she just yells back she's sitting 20 feet behind him on the dais, and she just yells back, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," like that. Just yells it out. And you can see it, if you watch the YouTube video, you can see King is a very smooth guy, but he kind of patters a bit, and then she just yells it again, "Tell him about the dream." And at that moment, he sort of says to himself, really more to himself than to the crowd, he just says, "But we should not wallow in the valley of despair." And at that moment, he goes and just starts what we all know of as the "I Have a Dream" speech. And it's really one of the greatest speeches of all times. And we sort of tell that because, our point in the book is not that like fear is bad, and that we should just paint a happy face over global warming. We're stuck, we're stuck right now, as you all know, in a really awful war in Iraq, and we're in a very scary situation with Iran. And to not be afraid of those things would be to be comatose. And we're addicted to oil, and we've been addicted to oil, and global warming is really disturbing. But if you leave people there, they're paralyzed in fear, and they become smaller, not larger, and they become more selfish and more survivalist and not expansive and not generous and not altruistic. And so the argument is just sort of like, and this is what we were trying to do. It's a little shout from the back of the dais to say, let's just tell people about the dream a bit, and let's make that dream, every bit as large as the nightmare is negative and dark. So that's, I think that's sort of where we were coming from with that point about fear.
Yeah.